Welcome to this online interview on Neuralink, mind control and the law. On the weekend, Elon Musk provided a live demonstration of Neuralink's technology using pigs with surgically implanted brain monitoring devices. But what does this mean from a legal and ethical perspective? What are the implications of this type of technology that interfaces between the human brain and computer devices? To find out, the Australian Society for Computers and the Law invited Dr Michelle Sharpe and Dr Allan McCay to explore these issues and to call for urgent action in these uncharted waters. Now, over to Michelle and Allan.
Neuralink. What are some of the sort of therapeutic aims of this kind of technology?
So the immediate aims that Elon Musk announced at the weekend, Sydney time, was to restore capacities to people who may have something like a spinal cord injury or difficulty in communicating because of some sort of health condition. And but there was a bit of a sort of peering into the future, into how other forms of uses for this technology. I could say something about that, or we can.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose some of it's interesting, I guess, to start with sort of exploring some of what's already considered to be some of the therapeutic uses, so Alzheimer's and depression and epilepsy and that kind of thing. But there does seem immediately a sort of sci-fi Black Mirror, speculation about what this could, allow for. I mean, what are some of the uses or abuses that you think this sort of technology might allow for?
Talk about neurotechnology generally, and probably including Neuralink. I mean, once you can interact by brain to computer, you can do things like control a mouse, control a cursor, or control some sort of device like a wheelchair, or perhaps control a car or a drone. And then, of course, once you can do those things, presumably you could also commit offences with that kind of control. And then another aspect of, that's sort of more using neurotechnology to control things, but another aspect is stimulating the brain in order to maybe address things like depression, as you mentioned. And, that raises the possibility of overstimulation, understimulation, perhaps generating things like impulsivity or something that might lead to trouble. So there's a great things that are possible from neurotechnologies, including brain-computer interfaces, but there's problems.
And one of the problems that you've identified is overstimulation or understimulation of the brain. So we would have the capacity to alter ourselves, alter our personalities.
Yeah, I think the idea is that brain stimulation could address various aspects of a person's mental condition that are undesirable to them, and provide them a means of alteration, other than something like cognitive behavior therapy or medication, for example. And those kind of alterations might go wrong, have unintended side effects, and that sort of thing. Some of the difficulties are. I don't want to appear too too sort of downbeat about it, because as I say, I do think there are really wonderful. I mean, the possibility of restoring a person who has got locked-in syndrome, who can't move, that, you know, the possibility of restoring those capacities is just wonderful. So.
Yeah, I mean, and things like Alzheimer's or people suffering from severe depression, which can be debilitating, the therapeutic benefits to them are, you know, immense. But talking about how this device allows us to control impulses, what does this mean for crime and for offenders who, you know, say for example, you know, violent offenders who have, you know, strong, aggressive, you know, violent impulses? What does this technology mean for them, and what does it mean in the hands of the state?
Well, we've got a somewhat sketchy picture of what might be possible from Elon Musk's company. And so maybe I'll talk sort of more broadly about what neurotechnology might make possible. So I've, along with Dr. Nicole Vincent from UTS and Associate Professor Thomas Nadelhofer, the College of Charleston in America, as Marina mentioned, we've got a new book which has come out, and in that book, Frederick Gilbert and Susan Dodds have got a chapter in which they consider the possibility of brain implants that could detect the neural activity associated with something like an impulsive, angry outburst. Now, this may not be too sort of far-fetched, because you know, there's quite a lot of work already being done in another great thing, a technology that could detect epileptic seizures and the neural activity, and then perhaps issue a warning to somebody that you know, they might want to, who's about to have an epileptic fit, that they might want to you know, perhaps take some medication, or at least move out of a place where they might harm themselves. And so Frederick Gilbert and Susan Dodds, they consider the possibility of a similar warning system that might, you know, provide some information, perhaps by an SMS or something, to a person that was liable to a violent outburst. And they call that an advisory system. And then perhaps, you know, a person might have the option of saying, okay, I'd better just leave the situation, or something like that. Or to take it a step further, they considered what they call an automated system, which detects the onset of an impulsive or aggressive outburst, and then engages in some sort of brain stimulation with the in order to you know, to avert it, to sort of calm the person down. So the advisory system, they thought, would be increase autonomy. So it's sort of morally a good thing. It's like you know, sort of restoring or giving a capacity to someone to act more autonomously and not be a kind of slave to their impulses.
It gives them an opportunity to consider their actions and make a decision as a moral agent. But what about the automatic system that you've foreshadowed?
Well, the automatic system, they were more concerned about. So, you know, one possibility might be to think of somebody who really, you know, maybe someone like Begbie in the Scottish film Trainspotting, who had a terrible anger management problem. If he was, there was no sign that he wanted to address this, but let's say he did want to address it, and he did decide to get an automated system you know, you might think of that as a kind of autonomous decision in which he has sort of bound himself for the future. But the more concerning possibility was that they found to be a kind of serious diminution of autonomy, and quite concerning was the idea of it being imposed by the state in such a way that a person would kind of almost cease to be a proper moral agent. They'd lose the moral window in some ways, and they find that to be a great concern, because it was a diminution of moral agency.
Could it also be a form of kind of preventative punishment, a new kind of crime, a thought crime, for which there is an automatic in-bed kind of response?
Well, that's right. I mean, I think these kind of technologies, maybe even more so, brain-computer interfaces for control, raise the question of, you know, what's the criminal action? So that sort of segues to my own paper in the book. So traditionally, when somebody commits, well, as you know, the law has got the concept of the mens rea, the guilty mind, and the actus reus,
the external component of that.
The external component, yeah, and that's usually an action, which is usually a bodily action, okay, an omission or a status in some contexts, but most commonly it's a bodily action. And you know, let's assume that you can trigger some sort of external device like a brain drone. In America, they've got brain drone racing competitions, and let's assume that a person controls a drone by imagining bodily action. So let's say they wave their hand. They imagine waving their hand, and that signals the drone to turn right, and they've got control by these acts of the imagination. Then you might say, well, what was the criminal act? You know, what was the thing they did if they fly it into someone and injure them? What was the thing? What was the conduct constituting the actus reus for the for some form of assault? Was it a mental act? So could the law say, well, the act of imagining waving your hand, that was the conduct constituting the actus reus? That seems a sort of significant step in the history of the law.
Yeah.
It's thus far drawn something of a distinction between the mens rea was supposed to be the mental part, and the actus reus was somehow external.
Or does the actus reus become something new? Does it become the electrical input pulses from the device itself?
Yeah, so that's one possibility. So, like, if a judge was pressed to consider what the conduct constituting the actus reus was, they might prefer to keep the actus reus in a kind of bodily sense. Say, okay, well, you kind of jiggled your motor cortex. So it seems somewhat artificial, doesn't it? By imagining a hand wave, you jiggled your motor cortex or something of that nature. And the neural activity, that's the conduct constituting the actus reus. Or if it was an implanted device, so let's say the Elon Musk Neuralink is implanted, you might say, well, the device is part of the agent, the part of the defendant. So the defendant's kind of a cyborg, and they've flowed signal to the through the device, and that was part of their body. And then you might have a question: well, where does the agent end and the defendant, sorry, cyberspace begin? maybe it's not so hard. Maybe that is less of an issue for the Neuralink technology, because it does seem to end at the, at the skull, because it's not, there's no wire. Older forms of brain computer interfaces had wires leading to the computer, whereas at least this one goes through the air, through Bluetooth or something.
In a way, I mean, how is it any different from, take for example, the example I think you use in your book of revenge porn. So how is it any different from causing the electrical impulses in my brain to move a cursor from causing the electrical impulses in my brain to use my hand to move the cursor? I mean, what's the difference really?
So I think there's no moral difference, and like I don't think anybody should be acquitted. I can't see any moral reason to acquit anyone of an offence just because they acted by way of brain-computer interface rather than a traditional bodily action. They should be on a par. But I guess there's just this kind of theoretical question. I suppose that, like if there was some sort of question of temporal coincidence, a judge might actually have to say, well, what was in order to consider whether mens rea and actus reus occurred at the same time, a judge might have to decide what it was. What was the thing that was supposed to have occurred at the same time? But yeah, I don't really for a moment think that a person would be found not guilty. The courts will say something is the conduct constituting the actus reus. It's just kind of interesting sort of theoretical question as to what was it, because it seems like legal doctrine is somewhat set up with a kind of presupposition behind it, and the presupposition is that people act through their bodies, and so I don't think it'll proceed on. They'll get through it, and people will be convicted that ought to be convicted, but
you think it might cause a rethinking of actus reus, or will it cause us to abandon it altogether? I mean, we do with some offences. Yeah,
the idea of abandoning actus reus seems drastic. But I guess it just forces this theoretical question. I mean, I think it's hard to say, what might be decided to be the conduct constituting the actus reus. I canvass three options: mental act, neural activity, flow of signal, or they could go for some kind of combination. But either way, I think, when it goes up to some sort of court high up in the hierarchy, and some judges make a decision, I think it will be something to, I guess, like the idea of wrestling with technology is not a new thing. Like we can remember the internet and some of the difficulties in adapting to internet crimes, but that's more like chapter 11. This is a bit more chapter 1, isn't it? And it's sort of a bit of raises a bit more sort of questions that might be more of interest to legal philosophers and philosophers of action and that sort of thing.
Yeah. I mean, you also write a bit about free will, and in your most recent book, as we've discussed, you talk about the rethinking of actus reus, but I also wondered whether it would prompt us to rethink mens rea. So how sensitive are these Neuralinks? I mean, can they, examine and act on our thoughts before we're even aware of a thought? And so I was thinking, take the example you have in your book about actus reus and revenge porn. So, what is the act when somebody is moving a cursor to distribute, to distribute an intimate, image?
Yeah.
Also combined with the fact that Elon Musk himself, in his announcement, has said that these links will potentially in the future allow us to record and download our memories.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I immediately thought of that chapter you write on revenge porn, but, it made me think, is it possible that sitting in front of a computer that is interfaced with this link, is there scope for, inadvertently downloading, intimate, memories and distribution of them? And what does that mean for things like revenge porn and the mens rea?
I think there's a few things there. I mean, like one thing is there's an interesting question about control as it comes to mental acts. So these devices, they have to be set up in such a way as the device doesn't affect an action that the person doesn't want to happen. But then you don't want to make it too difficult, so they kind of have to jump through 8 hoops before anything gets done. So there's this kind of fine line between making it too easy and too hard to give effect to actions. And there's an interesting question that maybe we'll find out in due course is whether people have got less control over their mental acts than their bodily acts. Like if you say don't raise your hand, it's easy for me to not raise my hand. If you just say don't imagine waving your hand, that might be a bit harder, and I might have a bit less control. So that's one thing. The memory thing, I mean, that also is very interesting. This seems to be more further down further down the track, but there's other companies that are looking at restoring memory, and particularly you mentioned people with Alzheimer's, and that that's a wonderful thing if somebody manages to crack that problem. But in the book, Walter Glannon, he considers what's known as hippocampal prosthetics, and these are devices that are the idea is that they can store memories, and I suppose theoretically, if memories can be stored, then maybe they could be inadvertently distributed. And from it, the legislation I looked at in the paper, I think is the intimate images legislation from New South Wales, and I think the mens rea was intention and recklessness as well. I think I don't think it was a negligent one, but maybe they would have to consider that. Hippocampal the whole idea of memory is quite an interesting thing, because like you think about something like gross negligence manslaughter, where somebody forgets to do something, leaving a
child in a car or something like that.
And Walter Glannon in the book explores that possibility and considers the question of let's assume some sort of hippocampal prosthetic device fails, and the person doesn't actually store a memory because this device fails. Maybe it's never failed before, and it fails, and they don't retrieve the memory because there was no memory there for them to retrieve. There's kind of this interesting question, like
who's responsible for that?
Yeah, did they forget? Are they to be seen as a sort of cyborg and the system forgot, or are they a person who is using a tool, this hippocampal thing, and they didn't forget, there was this kind of malfunction in a device they were using. So that could be an interesting argument.
And who's responsible for that? I mean, also I suppose that ties back to what we were talking about earlier in terms of a use by the state or individuals voluntarily to control certain antisocial impulses. Can that also create in us not just where we sort of cease acting as a moral agent, but also a false sense of moral security, where we stop, exercising that muscle?
Yes, yeah, that's interesting, isn't it? And it seems like if that were to be the case, it's people's lives and are, you might, so one view is that people's lives are kind of sum of choices, and if those choices are too heavily controlled by external devices, it raises some some sort of philosophical questions about what kind of life is left if it's not an autonomous life.
Yeah,
but then on the other hand, there might be a sort of community protection benefit.
Yeah, so on one hand there's this idea of community protection, but on the other hand, what is left to us? We don't have freedom, and how do you evolve morally if you don't have that freedom either? Yeah.
I mean, I suppose sort of extrapolating, you might think, well, there's kids don't need any moral instruction. They can just. Yeah. I mean, obviously we're peering along into the future and exploring possibilities, but maybe it's worth doing that to to consider some of the shorter term steps.
Yeah, as you say, or I think as pointed out by one of the authors in your book, it's perhaps not that far into the future if we can already see and predict epileptic seizures. It doesn't seem to be a giant step to predict certain antisocial impulses and to head those off automatically.
Yeah, that seems right. The idea of machine learning approaches detecting the neural patterns associated with impulsive outbursts doesn't seem quite so far into the future. If they can do it with epileptic fits, well, maybe the same. I mean, I've been doing a bit of work recently with a group. It's called we're kind of involved in looking at what's known as neuro rights, and at Columbia University there's Professor Raphael Just, he's a very eminent neuroscientist. He's very concerned about technology, neurotechnology, where it's going, and he thinks it's very important to consider all this from human rights perspective, and he's he's a scientist, and he's sort of at the cutting edge of all this at Columbia in New York, and he thinks it's time to consider these things, not just regard them as speculative science fiction.
Well, it seems to be that would then enable us to not respond reactively to these things. So, wait for problems or disasters to emerge and wait for the community to be morally outraged and then act, but that, we could, help manage these things before they reach kind of, before there's some kind of crisis. Because as you say, the therapeutic benefits are, immense.
They're immense. I mean, one of the things that struck me watching the Neuralink announcement over the weekend was that they had a range of people involved in the project, and they did a bit of work to allay concerns about the treatment of the animals, but everybody else seemed to be some form of scientist, or engineer. And I wondered if it might be good to have, sitting on the row with them, some kind of ethicist,
yes,
explaining something about some of the steps they were taking to. I think they did manage. I think they did mention some sort of cyber security, privacy risks, but I think there's others, and that might have been a good thing to do.
Yeah, I agree. What are the ethical and legal implications? Because one of the other things that struck me about the presentation is that we were told it's not going to be a closed system, and so one wonders what might be the scope in terms of brain hacking, hacking into somebody's brain, and already there are concerns with social platforms like Facebook and how that can be manipulated.
Yeah.
So how governments, how businesses might even be able to have access to thoughts and desires that we may not even be consciously aware of, and how that information might be manipulated.
Yeah, that's right. I think the sort of historian and futurist Yuval Noah Harari, he's considered some of these issues, but more specifically the sort of brain jacking thing. One of the people that I'm involved in working with at the moment, Marcello Ienca from Zurich, he's written on that issue, that what if somebody hacks into a device and cause it, say, to stimulate, or at a time when that shouldn't be done, and someone behaves differently. So this is quite it's sort of quite an amazing thing to think of, but it's that's something that needs to be considered.
Yeah, I mean, I know at the moment with mobile phones, for example, you could be walking past a store and it tracks you, and then you'll get a little advertisement, hey, this store has 30% on this particular product, why don't you go in? Can you imagine something like that, but in your brain, where it might be indistinguishable from your own authentic thoughts?
Yeah, it's very concerning.
Advertisers' dream, consumers' nightmare, do you think?
Yes, yeah. I mean, people are talking about sort of right to mental privacy and right to mental integrity, and there's a bit of work being done mainly by philosophers and not so much lawyers on that. And a lot of the human rights documents were, a lot of, like, the Universal Declaration was created a long time ago, before things like this seemed possible. And my understanding is, like, in Chile, they're re-examining their constitution, and there's a bit of lobbying to get something about mental privacy in it. But this is, we've sort of talked a bit about criminal law, but I was wondering, have you got any thoughts about implications of these kind of technologies for the civil law, or consumer law? Any thoughts on that?
Well, absolutely. I mean, I think the implications are immense, and to some extent they mirror, I think, some of the concerns that you highlight in criminal law. Issues around free will and consent, entry into contracts. I mean, the Australian consumer law, the reason why it exists, it's premised on this idea that a free economy is an efficient economy. It's an economy that benefits all, within the Australian society. So things like misleading and deceptive conduct and unconscionable conduct, which disrupts essentially sort of free thought, is prohibited. But imagine an implant which undermines the integrity of free thought and
Yeah.
consent.
Yeah.
That I mean, we talk about. I know that there's real concerns about privacy and how data is being used. In terms of the purchases we make and the things that we search through social platforms and online. But imagine something even closer to us. Imagine a link that's not a closed system, that interfaces with computers, that interfaces with others, that interfaces with potentially businesses and apps.
Yeah.
What kind of bevy of information that might provide businesses, how that might be used or misused.
Yeah.
And maybe even the implanting of thoughts, if I suppose we could all imagine sort of the extreme where, a state or a terrorist group or a ne'er-do-well might hijack somebody's brain. But, perhaps, we could think of, dare I say it, someone closer to home, a business, what it might be able to do with that kind of information and that kind of power.
Or even if implanting a thought was a bit too technically difficult, just stimulating a brain to trigger impulsivity or something like that. That would
you're walking past
maybe an easier, shorter term one.
Yeah, and that wouldn't seem to be terribly difficult, even with the current technology. So let's say, you geographically, through GPS, you're being identified as passing a certain fast food store, then you get an impulse. You're hungry. That wouldn't seem too fantastical a thing to imagine. Would you agree?
Yeah. Well, possibly. Yeah. I think another area is employment law. The idea of monitoring, say, the driver of a heavy goods vehicle's brain to detect for signs of drowsiness. There's I think there's quite a lot in this for employment lawyers to consider, or the question of whether an employer might somehow be might require some sort of brain technology. And it might lead to somewhat, for some people, somewhat dystopic sort of competition in which employees are competing with each other in neurotech to stimulate their concentration, stimulate their
that scenario that you've just posited seems to have two potential implications. One, I suppose, is this kind of slippery slope. So it starts perhaps from a good place. We just want to monitor our employees to make sure they're safe, occupational health and safety. But you can see how that can be a slippery slope.
Sure.
But then the other potential area is this idea that there's scope for us to become part human, part machine, kind of cyborg, and then what that might do, particularly for society, that if you have the means to increase your ability to retain information, to process information, to stay awake. I mean, what does that do to society for those people who have the resources to access that kind of technology?
Yeah, I mean, it sort of raises again. I've been quite interested in the work of Yuval Noah Harari, and he's not a legal theorist, but he's got some interesting ideas. But he's envisaged a split in which you can imagine the enhanced and the unenhanced, and the sort of ethical problems. I mean, like one issue is the question of how widespread the technology turns out to be. I think Elon Musk was saying he was hoping to at some point get it down to a couple of $1,000.
Yeah.
Maybe it'll come down to maybe I don't think it's necessarily the case. You know, it's, I suppose it's one possibility is that it does turn out to be used to be possible to make quite cheaply. But then, you know, maybe people are going to keep getting upgrades, and that will be the sort of wealthy people.
Yeah, but base model and upgrades.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
But I saw it. I mean, it was like something out of a sci-fi movie or a Black Mirror episode that you know, in order to do it as safely as cheaply as possible, and he's developed this machine. So it's not a human being who insists. You know, it's a machine.
That's right.
So, I mean, another film that it made me think of was Total Recall.
Oh, yeah.
You know, you see Arnold Schwarzenegger, you know, he booted the machine. So it doesn't seem so crazy that we have this machine that, you know, can insert everybody with a link, but in terms of the upgrades and what you can afford, maybe it creates a new class system, perhaps.
Yeah, that does seem to be one of the concerns. I mean, what Elon Musk has said, he's worried about some sort of technological singularity, and he thinks an upside is that it might allow humans to keep pace with AI. But that's but it might only be some humans that if that is a problem. I'm not saying that is a problem, but if he's right, it's. I mean, I think one thing that is interesting is my feeling about this is there's a lot of ethicists that are engaged in considering this, and there's a lot of and some scientists like Raphael Just from Columbia, but there's not a huge number of lawyers or legal scholars engaged in this. You know, there's an area of scholarly research called neurolaw, and there's been a lot of discussion about what brain scans might be used for in the criminal justice system, and also in civil matters as well, about testamentary capacity and that sort of thing. But there's not a great deal about intervening on brains and using brains to control devices, and this was really one of the things that led my friend and colleague Dr. Nicole Vincent to start the project. But another thing is I think a lot of people have focused on like me, have focused on the criminal law side, but I think there's not enough legal attention to this. And also within the legal attention that exists, there's certainly not enough in areas outside criminal law.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of work to be done by lawyers, I think, and law reform bodies, and you know, I feel it's not got enough attention from lawyers. That's what I believe.
Well, I would be, at the risk of sounding self-interested, I would be, as a lawyer, inclined to agree with you, and particularly being deeply interested in consumer protection. What I tend to see is nothing quite motivates like money. And you know, while there's certainly sort of aspects to the criminal law and sort of state control that's sort of deeply troubling. You know, I wonder whether in fact the greatest threat might be from corporates and from sort of scammers to not so much, you know, gain power, but in order to, you know, increase their coffers. You know, what can be done with that kind of information, because with the technology we currently have, we already see that happening. You know, we see, you know, use and abuse of, you know, data from mobile phones, from sort of social media, you know, and very, very subtly. So it does, you know, raise the sort of question about, you know, how this might be used or abused by businesses. But particularly when right from the outset, it's not intended. I mean, as sort of Elon Musk has, declared quite proudly, this isn't going to be a closed system. This is a way for us to interface with the internet, with computers, and with each other. So, the scope for abuse seems to be vast, I think.
Yeah, and they also in terms of I think another thing that's worth considering is in terms of the regulation of this. There's there's implanted devices like Neuralink's device, and then there's other forms of non-invasive brain-computer interfaces that are marketed direct to consumers, and they sort of avoid the medical sort of regulatory scheme, because they're not, they're just reading from the brain. They're not stimulating. They're not invasive. It doesn't involve surgery. And so there's a question about the sort of regulatory scheme, I think.
Yep, how these things are managed and try to prevent harm to the community.
Yeah. There's a lot to. I think that's right. I think that's the upshot of it all. There's a lot to. It's like we've only just started thinking about that, and there's a lot more to think about, and in many areas of law, and we're just beginning.
Yeah, and I think the time actually to think about it is now, because if we don't, then we'll just be playing catch up, won't we? I mean, we'll just be reacting to every problem that emerges, but instead, and I think this comes
5
back
years later,
and I think this comes back to the point that you're making, that perhaps the innovators should be working alongside with ethicists and lawyers now, so that they can craft these devices in a way to potentially head off these problems before they emerge. Because I think because of the therapeutic benefits are so great, the last thing you want is to stop it, or for a state to out of fear because something unforeseen has happened, to really clamp down hard on this. I mean, this is the last thing I think we would want.
That's right. Yes. No, I agree. Yeah. No, that would be terrible, because there's a wonderful upside to it, as well as these pitfalls. So yeah, I certainly wouldn't want it to stop. We could keep going on, but it's great. Anyway, it's been great to discuss this with you. I'd like to chat further, and I hope we do at some point. And
no, thank you very much. It's really been really mind blowing, no pun intended. All the potential applications for this kind of technology, and certainly in criminal law, but also in the areas I'm deeply interested in terms of formation of contracts and consumer protection. I mean, the mind boggles in terms of the potential application and abuses of it.